Laura Fruggeri, welcome to the Systemic Conversations series without a name just yet. It's lovely to be talking with you. Where are you, Laura? Which bit of Italy are you in?
I'm in Modena.
Modena.
Yeah.
Just for those of us who can't immediately visualize a map of Italy, please explain where Modena is.
Modena is very near Bologna, which is in the center, north center of Italy. It's a little bit above Florence and south of Milano.
And
southeast of Milano, southwest of Venice, north of Florence. So it's a beautiful area.
When I went to, and people probably know Modena from, is it associated with balsamic vinegar? Am I making this up?
Yeah, aceto balsamico. Yes, of course. This is the land of balsamic vinegar.
What
and
else?
Also cars.
Sorry?
Cars, Ferrari.
Oh.
Even if not at the moment, they don't seem to be very good, but Ferrari, Maserati, Modena is in the car industry place.
Okay. Have you lived
traditionally?
Have you lived there a long time?
Oh yes, I have to say all my life. Actually, I was born in a town near Modena, Castelfranco, Emilia. I moved to Modena after my graduation, when I started working.
How old were you? How old were you then?
When I moved to Modena, I moved to Modena in 1980. So I was 1980. Yes. So I was 32.
32.
So I lived in Castelfranco for 30 years.
So in these talks, I'm really interested in finding out where people came from. Sounds a lineal idea, I know, but there's some interesting stories people have to tell about where they came from and about where they ended up going to, and something about the zigzagging journey on the way. So you were born in Castelfranco. Is that what? Yeah.
Castelfranco, Emilia. Because you also have other kind of Castelfranco, means free castle.
Right.
So you can find that as name of towns around Italy. And my Castelfranco is Castelfranco, Emilia. Emilia, which is the region.
Yeah, yeah.
You also have other.
What's the terrain like around there? Is it mountainous or
flat?
Flat.
It's very flat. Yes, very flat. Not far from the mountains, not far from the sea, but this area is very flat. Yeah.
And what
you can see the mountains actually from the window.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
the Apennines. You can see the Apennines.
I know the other side of the Apennines from flying into Pisa and driving up the coastline there and going into the mountains.
Yeah, that is exactly the other side of it. Yeah.
So, Laura, let's just go back to what kind of family were you born into? What kind of culture were you born into?
I'm now 72.
Ooh.
So I was born, right after World War II. My parents, very young. They were very young. My mother was 19 and my father 22 when I was born. And my family was it has been always a working class family. And with very strong principles, socialist. So my father has a very strong socialist, perspective of the world somehow, even if together with a very, very strong sense of freedom. So I think that the values of my family were, both community and freedom at the same time. I have two siblings, so we are almost the same age, because my sister is a year younger than me, and my brother is a year younger than my sister. So the three of us, we were pals, we were peers, we would play together when it was not possible to go out. Fortunately, I had a childhood that was lived a lot outside on the yard, together with other kids and of the neighborhood. So
was it a town with close streets and little space, or was there a lot of space? And how far did you go?
No, not a lot of space. No, not a lot of space. But the center of the town is very much like Bologna, if you know Bologna, with the porticos and narrow streets. But right outside of it, this very small city center, you would have houses with the yard. Not gardens, but yard where people could, kids would play and adults would talk and chat, meet there to talk and chat. So it was a very community kind of life.
Were there other people in the town who also had strong socialist leanings?
Oh yeah, the majority actually. The majority, the area, in particular the area where I lived my first years, was known as a place where families were very much, either communist or socialist oriented.
Were they the same kind of socialist, or were there different groups of different understandings of socialism?
There were actually, because you had the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the Social Democratic Party.
So where was your father in this, and what were your mother's politics?
My mother's family, grandfather and her brothers were communist in the Communist Party, and my father's family was more social democratic.
So how did the families feel about the social democratic marrying the communist and vice versa?
No, I wouldn't say that this was important in terms of categorization of people. I think that the political belonging was mainly, something in terms of value, in terms of exactly perspectives on the world, on people, on relationship. So I guess that what really connected all of them was this idea that I said, in terms of community, generosity. I realized only many years later that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother on my father's side, actually the first 7 years, or I have to say the first 7 years of my life, we all lived together like a big family. My grandparents, my uncle, my aunt, my father and mother, my siblings, my cousin, we were all living together, as it used at that time. And my mother's family was living on the third floor, and us with my father's family were living on the first floor of this building, you know. So we were really very close, very. Now I don't remember what I was going to say for this. Oh, I don't know.
I was wondering about, I was imagining that your family, from both sides of your parents, had been through a really hard time in the Second World War.
Yes.
People think the Second World War, a lot of younger people think the Second World War was like so long ago, but it was a few years before we were born.
Yeah.
And that was the context, economic, political, social, that we were born into.
Yeah. Yes, it was. And the narrative in my family was very much a narrative of how, Italy resisted against fascism and against Nazism. I mean, that was very important. My grandfather, was beaten up by the fascists because of his ideas. The other grandfather was taken to a concentration camp in Verona, from where he had to escape. So we were told all these stories and the importance of being against fascism, against Nazism, against dictatorship, against everything that is not the freedom of people, the democracy.
Well, of course, political movements are based on ideologies, and one of the things that systemic thinking and theory has been very good at, is, especially with the advent of social construction, is to understand the power of ideology on everyday narratives about who counts, what matters, what's possible. And political movements also take a lot of organization, whether it's public or hidden, local or international. So
yes. I was thinking, that since you were asking, the position of my family and larger families with respect to socialism and communism, it's interesting because then, once I came to, you have to think that being born in 48, I was 20 in 1968. Famous 68. So, of course, I also took part into the revolutionary movement of the students at that time. So it's interesting because, of course, how can you become, take a position, an autonomous position with respect to your parents? They were already revolutionary, they were already communist and so on. So, of course, I was even extra.
How did you do extra? Because I had just wondered that same thing. How come you didn't become some,
Awesome.
nice, conformist, capitalist wife?
I think that was so really out of the picture in my family. You have to think that there's a very important part of my life, that is when I was 16, I was in my, how do you define it? It was third year of high school, third of 5 years of high school. So I was 16. Someone came to school and said that if we wanted, it was 65. You have to remember it was 1965. If we wanted, we could apply for studying for a year in the United States. So I went back home and said, I want to do this to my family, to my father and mother. As I said, we were a working class family. So first thing my father said was, what about the money? I mean, how much would that cost? So I said, I don't know, but I really want to do this. I really want to do this. So just to let you know how my father was and is, he said, well, let me take information. I first want to see if it is possible. If it is possible, you can try. And so he, asked for information. He contacted families that had already, had kids who did this experience. So he came home and said, they told me that you can go, we don't have to pay anything if you show that, you are good enough to cope with this experience. So I went for a year in the United States.
How old were you then?
I was, my 17th birthday, I was born 16th of October. I did it in the United States. Wow. I became 17 in the United States. And I stayed there for a year.
Where did you land? Where did you spend that year?
In Chicago. North part of Chicago. In a family, of course. I mean, I was with a family. It was this program, this American Field Service program. It's exchange students. Actually, at that time, now it is exchange students. At that time, was all the world to the United States. But that was, quite an experience for me. Quite an experience.
In what ways?
Well, first of all, we were supposed to go around, give speech about our country. We were very much into this idea of being, like a diplomatic ambassador of our countries. Uh-huh. And so that was like, to put yourself in a position of responsibility in terms of knowing what you say, also, interesting enough, being Italian, fight against prejudice. Because at that time, in the United States, Italy was just mafia. Now Italy is the stylish Italy, food, fashion and everything. But at that time, no, that was the stereotype of Italy in terms of southern Italy, mafia and everything. So, also I had to really, make arguments, show people that there was a prejudice, that Italians were different. And I mean, it's a really interesting experience. Plus, I met many other people from all different countries. And so, I had as a friend a Turkish woman, a Swedish man, an Irish, an Icelandic one, Southern Africa. I mean, that was really, really...
That's really something. And tell me, did you fall in love during that year? I mean, 17 in Chicago.
Yes.
Big adventure. How many times did you fall in love that year?
Of course, yes. But it was like, a period. Then I knew that I was
just going home.
Yeah, going home. But that was okay. I have to say that was okay. How
was going home after that year then, and how did it
First
change your plans? Did it shift anything about your story of yourself and a future and what you were going to study?
Yeah, I think so. Well, first of all, I wanted to go back. Many people said, oh, the United States. Oh, I had a fantastic period there. I'm very grateful for this experience and everything, but was also very happy to go back home, because at home I was anyway part of a group of people, young people as we were, but involved in many volunteer initiatives, in town, which was not yet political. It became political, but anyway, at least it was a social involvement in community, in also helping people who had no opportunities, this kind of activities. And so I wanted to go back home. In the first period, it was like shocking, because it was so different in terms of culture and everything. And
did you feel critical of Italian culture?
No, never.
Culture, never.
No, never. I was critical of the American culture, which I felt as superficial and formal with respect to the way I was used. As I told you, I was used to a very community kind of life. And in fact, there was a teacher in the high school I was attending there that would involve students in the programs, social programs, something that would help the people, the students in south of Chicago, which was the Black community of Chicago. And we would go like once a week, I think, helping children of those schools to do their homework. And there, that was the community, the style of life that I knew. People staying, playing in the street, talking, chatting outside the houses. And that was, to me, much more similar to the community I was used than the white middle class, high middle class.
That makes me think a lot about how do we create, we maybe don't have to talk about this now, but it jumps me to thinking about how do we create systemic places of therapy or treatment or whatever we want to call them, which feel like an extension of that culture rather than the north versus the south of the kind of distant streets and the big disconnected suburbia of clinic, as opposed to people feeling a sense of ownership of the space. Has that influenced things in terms of how you've developed your practice?
I think so. I think so, because I think that I came to systemic therapy thinking going through political, first of all, experience. I was very much involved in 68, 69, 70, 71 in political, demonstration. I would wake up very early in the morning to go, at the gates of the industries around Modena, to preach.
To talk to people and
this is funny because to talk to the workers and tell them that the Communist Party was not revolutionary enough, that there was more. It was a more left position, to fight against the landlords, the owner of the industries and so on. So I did that for many years, I was also involved in as a representative in the town, in the township in Castelfranco. So, I mean, for those years, which correspond to my 20, 21, 22, 23. I was politically involved a lot.
Were you studying at the same time, or
I
working?
was studying political sciences.
Ah.
My major at the university, in the undergraduate courses was sociology.
What were you planning to do then with a political sciences and sociology education?
I was very much thinking of doing the sociologist, which is someone involved in the community plans, and that was my idea. But during the year of my university 4 year, I met psychology, because psychology was one of the exams I had to take, and I fell in love with psychology.
But there are so many psychologies. There were then, there are probably more now. Which psychology was it you fell in love with? What was it about psychology?
The reading Goffman.
Irving Goffman.
Yes, Esalions.
So say more about what grabbed you about Goffman's work.
Well, because of the analysis he did of the institutions, like prisons or psychiatric hospital and so on. And while I was studying this, I had the chance, because one of my very, very, very dear friend, she was a social worker, and she worked within the psychiatric service. So here we have another path, which is converging here. She was involved with that group of psychiatrists that were trained by Basaglia, who is the psychiatrist that opened up the psychiatric hospitals and actually closed down the psychiatric hospitals. So there I was in these years, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. I was at the university. I was politically involved, and I came across the experience of Basaglia and this completely different way of thinking of the psychiatric illness.
So this was another political critique.
Yeah.
Whether it was political critique of factories and owners, or whether it was a critique of institutions and their patients.
Yeah. And I think that the idea of looking at the psychiatric patients and make the effort to see something different, that is resources, human beings. That was to me the lesson by Basaglia, which actually was what brought me to this profession.
So it wasn't,
because I did my dissertation actually on the experience of the rehabilitation of psychiatric patients. My dissertation was on this kind of experience.
And that's against the backdrop of the closure of psychiatric hospitals.
Yeah.
The reason I was picking up on whether you fell in love with psychology or which area of psychology you fell in love with, for me is a big political issue, because a lot of psychology and psychotherapy has gone off into decontextualize treating the individual as a site of illness. And even when you're talking about the rehabilitation, I'm imagining you were thinking about the rehabilitation in the context of community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The experience I lived was also connected with the experience in UK of Maxwell Jones, I think. You know, the psychiatric community, all that was also a big experience, the democratic, what in Italian we call democratic psychiatry, which is a psychiatry that recognizes, you know, the humanity in all people. And the main reason there was institutions make psychiatric patients what they are. If you free them from the institution, then you can finally see what they are as persons.
And you're right, in the UK we had a similar movement at that time. That has been not so much disbanded, so much as deflated by lack of public funds, because it was never considered. The Richmond Fellowship, the Philadelphia Association, Arbors Association foregrounded a different story of people in context as having social problems, psychological problems, as social responses to all kinds of things.
So I have to say that in Italy, the ideas of Basaglia became majority. It started as a minority, but it really spread all over, and I think conquered all the psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, and nurses of my generation.
How do you think there was a connection between the kind of socialism, communism of northern Italy and the critique of power and ownership with the dismantling or challenging of how psychiatric resources were structured?
Yeah, I think, to me, this is all within a context of, looking, of the perspective of looking at, my position. I see that as a different aspect of one position of me being in the world. And as I said, the idea of community on one side, and so solidarity, this idea of solidarity, of respect for people, of importance of relationship. This comes from my family. This comes from my studies. This comes from my experience in terms of political, and also, I would say, group of friends, with which we shared all this.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yes, friendships and politics and professional interests all connected.
Yeah. All connected somehow.
So how did you get, what was the next jump? Or was there an interim jump or several jumps into, I guess I'm interested, like probably many others will be by this point, of at what point did systemic stuff come in? Okay,
so after I graduated, at that time there was not a formal PhD program in the university. It was it was more like an apprenticeship, I had a fellowship for 2 years at the university for studying and doing research. And at the same time, I had a contract to work in the psychiatric field, in the psychiatric service, where I had been working already for my dissertation. Okay, so after I discussed my dissertation, they offered a contract for some hours a week to work in the psychiatric field. So after graduation, I was doing research at the university and working, in the psychiatric field as well. And we were doing this kind of program, community program, taking all the long-term patient of the psychiatric hospital back home, or at least in the community, and also approaching the whole idea of the psychiatric illness from a very contextualized, community-rooted approach. Okay, so for example, as psychologist, I wouldn't sit in a study and in an office and talk to the patient. I would go see them at home. I would go and talk to their landlord if this was needed. We would help them to cope with the everyday problem. Most of the time, these psychiatric patients were also poor in terms of resources. And so they needed, to be helped to reconstruct themselves in terms of identity, of agency, and also, being able to find the resources to live with. So we had all this. Pardon?
What did that look like, Laura, in terms of helping people think about agency?
Agency means they help them to believe they can make it.
Was that just about belief, or was it also about advocating differently for themselves?
Yeah, right. Yes.
Because I sometimes think advocacy is one of those very underplayed themes in the psychotherapies generally, or social work, but that a lot of our job is either being an advocate or coaching our clients to become advocates for themselves or their children.
That's the right thing. That is it.
It fits with your politics and your political experience about believing in change and finding one's own power on behalf of the family or the community.
Exactly. So I've done that together with other colleagues, psychiatrists, other psychologists. Again, we were this group which were we would work together, do politics together, be friends, just, have dinner together, go to the movie together. I mean, this group of people. Now, at a certain point, it was mid-70s. The politics in Italy, it became very difficult because we are talking of the so-called dark years of democracy in Italy. The fascist bombs who killed people on trains or in the squares where people would get together on one side. On the other side, the Red Brigades who would attack the state, and they wouldn't use bomb, they would kill people as example of how the power had to be beaten, destroyed. So if it was clear to me that, I didn't have anything to do with the fascists doing that, it was very difficult to see people that you would consider comrades in terms of wanting, the people, justice, social justice, going so far to kill. So it was very difficult at that time in Italy to have a position in terms of
and
political
presumably,
position.
if you were not joining with those extremes, then you were seen as some liberal, middle of the road traitor to the cause.
Yeah, which was difficult because at the beginning there was the accusation we would move to the Communist Party, who immediately, took a distance from these people killing in name of people.
Mm.
So for us, my generation was kind of difficult because you would stand there between the Communist Party taking a very, very institutional position, so accusing that you cannot do that if you cannot talk in name of people if you kill on one side. On the other side, I was completely in disagreement of that. I was a non-violent person, so I wouldn't share anything.
Mm.
That period has become a very, very a crossroad for many of us, of my generation. Also, in terms of age, we were coming to an age where we were asked to take responsibility in the profession. Some of us would have children. So we came to an age where decisions had to be made. And I think that my generation went, 2, 3 different roads. One was the terrorism, the left, the red terrorism, which was quite a difficult period in Italy. The other was drug, heroin. Many people start using heroin that period and die then. And other people, like me, I think, that, just went into institutions, took the responsibilities that this meant. Some of us would have, responsibility, professionally speaking, responsibility in terms of being head of services, of programs, and so on. So that was when I think I felt that politics, values, community was not enough anymore. I needed something which would be more methodologically or epistemologically founded.
Okay.
Even something more technically. The question was, technically, no, it was more like methodological.
Yes, that makes
sense.
sense.
How exactly have criteria for our actions. Methodology is this, to have criteria that you can use, analyze situation, and so on.
And perhaps, sorry.
Pardon? No.
I was thinking about theories of change.
Yeah.
And the examples you'd given, this kind of crossroads that people reached where they had to decide which road to go down, was a sort of an enactment in response to change as a way of changing.
Yes,
And
exactly. Yeah, you said it. Yes, it was really how, change. When we say, we are solicited, by events, we cannot stay the same because, events ask us to change. People around you, situation around you, age, and meanwhile, I also started my relationship with Gianfranco. I met Gianfranco.
How did you meet? How did you meet?
We met at the university in Bologna because I was there with a fellowship, as I told you. He came as a professor of psychology in the same department of political science where I was. So he was older than I was. He was 8 years older. He was a professor already. And we met there. And we started our relationship. In those years, exactly, in terms of change, those years was when I started a profession. I started the relationship, which has become the relationship of my life. And I also started feeling that I needed to have a more systematic, somehow, to put all these ideas together into a less spontaneous political way, but it was more like the need for for instruments for reflection, for methodological criteria. And that is when I met Mara Silvini Palazzoli.
When you met who? Say it again.
Mara Silvini Palazzoli.
Okay, I didn't hear. Okay. And so that was in the context of the university or in some other context?
No, it was in the context of the university because I was giving a seminar at the university on family relationships. And with my Gianfranco and another colleague who was also professor of psychology, we decided to invite people, who had recently written something on families.
Okay.
And from different perspectives, psychodynamic and relational. So we invited a psychoanalyst, a very famous and very good, I have to say, psychoanalyst of Bologna, and who had written a book on families, and Mara Silvini Palazzoli, because Paradox and Counter Paradox had just been published.
Okay.
Just in those years. And so that's how I met her. And of course, I was.
But so you met her, tell me about that meeting. So there was the seminar, you were presenting or she was presenting?
I invited her to present.
Okay.
Within my seminar.
And then what happened? You talked to her before or after?
I talked to her after. And I said, I think that these ideas, and I said, do you have readings? Would you suggest me some readings to go further into this approach? She said, read Bateson.
Oh.
read Bateson.
And did you?
And I did. So then I contacted her again and said, you know, do you think of teaching, do seminars, courses? And she said, no, I don't. But I have two colleagues, Boscolo and Cecchin, who are thinking of starting a training. So I said, well, could I call them? She said, yeah, here, their numbers.
People need to remember there was no email in these days, no mobile phones, no internet, no websites, no Googling.
No.
Can I call them? Can you give me a telephone number? Okay.
She gave, and only telephone at home. No cell phone, no mobile.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
So you also had to call, you know, when should I call? You know, I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to disturb, or can I call? And so I called Boscolo, talked to Boscolo. And I said, you know, I would, you know, I met Mara Salvini Palazzoli. She told me that.
Say it in Italian for a moment. Let's not worry about the English. Just run through the conversation. Say it as if you were saying it in Italian.
Ok, ho conosciuto la professoressa Salvini Palazzoli, e ho molto apprezzato il vostro libro. Ho chiesto se facevate dei corsi della formazione e lei mi ha detto che voi, lei e il dottor Cecchin, state pensando di fare qualcosa. And he said, yes, sì. Stiamo pensando, ma how many of you are interested? I said, well, I'm not the only one, you know, some other could be. And so I went back to the psychiatrist I was working with, and I said, you know, they are thinking in Milano to start a training. So 8 of us went. And the first training that Luigi Boscolo and Gianfranco Cecchin did was with a group of people from Modena, a group of people from Padova, where Gianfranco and Luigi used to go for seminars also. And so they met Viaro, Mosconi, Peruzzi, a group from Milano. And so we started. They did 2 groups of 10, 12 people. And the training was this. They said, you can sit behind the mirror and watch us work. And then we would discuss with them, and discuss, and discuss, and discuss, always watching them working. Every once in a while they would, since they knew that I spoke English, every once in a while they would come and say, are you interested in this article? Well, we'll see. Never ask me then, you know, well, but just, you know, giving some suggestion, and then they asked me to join them in the training as teacher, and that's how, you know.
I feel it's so moving for me hearing this moment in time, both your own personal story of how you moved between the factory gates, your own, you know, Chicago, north-south, and the factory gates, your own family histories and those different discourses and commitments, and your own education and the political science into political psychology, or whatever one would want to call it. And then this meeting, the hunch about inviting Mara Salvini Palazzoli, and the asking for the phone number, the connections, the phone numbers, and the kind of casual, but are there others who want to join this program?
Yeah.
And the little pockets that became eventually, I'm sure, the Teams conferences. And, and there's something about how different this beginning world that I feel is so important for the systemic community to know about and own. Sometimes I've thought, Laura, when I've given stories about the history of systemic therapy, I've given stories sometimes using publications as my scaffolding for the story. And when I've a few years ago, a colleague of mine, Anne Hedvig Vedle in Norway, said, "Oh, when I get back to Oslo, I have to give a seminar on the history of family therapy. Gail, tell me what you would say." And I quickly went for a while. And then she said, "It's so interesting. In Norway, we tell a completely different story about the history of family therapy. We tell it through the meetings that happened." And for me, the papers offer the ideas and the temporal scaffolding, the chronology, the parallels going on in different places at the same time or overlapping. But I think nowadays the culture is, which program shall I apply for? Shall I go to Cardiff? Shall I go to Manchester? New program there? Shall I go to which of the London programs? Shall I go to Birmingham? Shall I go to Leeds or Edinburgh, or where shall I go to do my training? And there are lots of politics involved in it. There's lots of issues to do with practicality, but there's a lot of choice in certainly in England and Wales and Scotland. I don't know about Ireland, but Ireland proper. That's not the right way of saying it. Ireland as opposed to Northern Ireland, I'm familiar with programs. The point is, these courses are now established in many, and there was a time when there was somebody called Boscolo who was saying, "Are there others of you who might be interested in these ideas?" Of course, there were other family therapy training programs that pre-existed this moment in time, but in terms of Northern European interests, the Milan School was perhaps the most influential in a lasting way in terms of theorizing change. In particular, in terms of theorizing system in a range of ways and engaging with a range of other texts as well, such as Bateson and then Maturana and so on. So it's very moving to hear these stepping stones and your stepping stones.
Because you have to know that there wasn't any formal training in family therapy in Italy at that time. It was just, starting in Rome, Cancrini, and Andolfi. They started, but they were at the university. So they were psychiatrists at the university. And so they, I think, became influential in terms of family therapy because they started, with the training of the psychiatrists. They start teaching these ideas. But I think that the beginning of the training in Milano, because we were the first group of training ever, because, exactly, they didn't have a program.
And then you were invited into the teaching.
Yes. But they didn't, at the beginning, it was interesting because the theory of the training, the Milan training, we did it. I did it together with Valerio Gazzi. We wrote down, a formal program in terms of readings, topics and so on.
So you had the inspirational leaders, initiators of the program, but then you put together as the the next generation, which was presumably a year or two later, you put together something, you put a formality or at least a structure to it, so that students would benefit from everything that's been happening.
And Luigi and Boscolo would continue to do what they have always done, that is seeing families and discussing. And
do you think there's a gender thing here, that sometimes men do the turn-up performative stuff and the women do a lot of the organizational stuff and some performative?
Maybe, but it was the second generation was a mixed gender generation.
Okay.
I mean, there was both and. I mean, we were
okay.
We actually were the first two, Valeria and I, to teach, but soon after other people were involved, and both women and men. And I think that the next generation, with respect to Boscolo and Cecchin, were also asked somehow, and by Boscolo and Cecchin, and also offered, to give a systematization of the training, which meanwhile was, becoming more and more formalized, also recognized by the law, accredited by the Board of Education, and then, when it started, the institutionalization of the training in family therapy.
So family therapy as a formal training was rolling out in Italy. What were some of the international connections that had some resonance for you?
Okay, it was Boscolo and Cecchin that invited me to teach to the first summer school for foreigners.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
And do you remember anybody who came to that?
Yeah, I remember a guy who has been the editor of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy, that is Max O'Connolly, I think. He contacted me when Boscolo died, asking for, writing something. I remember him because he stayed in Milano for 3 months or so. So he would attend also the regular training, just sit there behind the mirror with the students and so on. So I met him.
With these programs, or were they, the summer school, was it more trying to create a community of conversation and practice?
Yeah, definitely. Even if, people were asked to present, to say something. And in particular, what Boscolo and Cecchin involved me, not only there, then they asked me to go to the United States also with them, teaching seminars. And then I went to Israel with Boscolo. So both Gianfranco and Luigi invited me to join them, doing things, internationally, which is how then I also become involved in I also I went to teach as visiting professor at the University of New Hampshire for a semester. From there, I had contact with Lynn Hoffman, who was living in Massachusetts at that time. And then Luigi and Gianfranco, Boscolo and Cecchin, also asked me if I was interested in going to the Oxford team conference, and then the seminar with Maturana. Also, that KCC organized, actually. KCC and also the Institute of Family Therapy. And
So, how did you experience the meeting of social construction when you were in the University of New Hampshire? Presumably that was through I can't remember who would have been there at the time, but Sheila Macklin, Jack Lanneman.
Sheila and Jack, yeah.
I don't think John was there just yet. John Shotter, that would have been
not yet. No.
Yes. So
he went later.
Yeah, but how did you understand? What did you go through in meeting social construction?
That was just before social constructionism became so important. But I have to say, Gail, that my approach to social constructionism came from a different part, because there's another change in my life.
Okay.
That is when I left the profession, the clinical profession, working in the psychiatric service, to take a position at the university as a professor at the university, full time. And I was teaching then social psychology. And it is through social psychologists, and especially the so-called European social psychology, that is Moscovici and Teifel as the major references, that I came across social constructionism and social constructivism. So, and also, through Billig's and Array, this person before then Ken Gergen.
Okay.
So I also recognize this as a very important part of what I am and of what I think, that is the study,
So did you go to New Hampshire after you started as a university professor?
Yes, yes. After I started as a university professor, yes.
So you were in part carrying some of the social construction or constructivist ideas.
I was at that time interested in CMM.
How did you find CMM?
I found CMM through the article by Cronin, Lanneman Johnson, reflexive loops, strange loops, and so on. And then a colleague of them, Sergio Perotta, came to Milano to be trained in Milano. He spoke Italian, being, of Italian origin. And he stayed in Milano for a year. Then Bosco and Cecchin invited me to join them to a conference in Calgary. That is where I met Sheila McNamee and Jack Lanneman. And we started, our connection. We exchanged ideas, starting from CMM and how that would apply to both research and therapy. But at that time, I was interested to apply it to research. And so that's how we became connected. Sheila came for a semester at the University of Parma. I went for a semester at the University of New Hampshire. And I think that at that time, we all were, Jack, Sheila, myself, all very much into Bateson studies, especially Bateson. And then social constructionism came, I think, later on.
So can I ask you a bit about your own professional contributions? I know it's a bit tricky in the systemic profession. People like to talk about what we have done, the history, the kind of community developments, and sometimes people are a little uncomfortable about focusing on their own work and the gifts of their own work. But I'm wondering, how can you describe what some of your written contributions have been? Take us through some of the key written publications or written contributions that have been important either to you or that you think have been important for the communities.
Well, we have to open a...
In whatever language.
Yeah, but we have to talk about this. How different it has been to be part of the international community, being not native in English. Because, of course, I think that I think I have very much been in the international scene. Thanks to the connections, a special connection with the colleagues in Dublin, Imelda and the other Philip and Nori, KCC, Peter Lang, Campbell, David Campbell at the Tavistock, colleagues from Sweden. Why am I saying all this thanks to them? Because they invited me. They invited me to teach, sometimes they invited me to write, okay? Because it was not that easy to be part of the international publications, not being, a native in English. So this is one thing.
Mm.
So most of my publications are in Italian.
Just going back a minute, are you saying there was a limit that there could have been more opportunities, but people didn't consider contributors, for example, who weren't first language English speakers?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that because of the situation, it was much harder.
Yeah.
No, I'm very grateful to all these colleagues I said, because they invited me. They, sometimes asked for chapters, articles, and that was important to me. But if I had to write something, I would write it in Italian. And sometimes in English, sometimes. But it's interesting, for example, that all the work we did, which was certainly second generation, on the systemic approach in the public institutions, psychiatric service, social services, and so on, were also published in English, thanks to colleagues. For example, David Campbell asked us to publish, our ideas about the mental health services in Italy. And not only that. So actually, as I said, I'm very grateful to all these colleagues that invited me.
Mm-hmm.
So, really helped me to stay in that scene, the international scene. But it's, of course, most of my publications are in Italian.
So which publications are you most pleased with?
I think my contribution to the field is that I embrace social constructionism without leaving out systemic. So the idea of system, to me, is not alternative to social constructionism. Social constructionism is more like the possibility of understanding the processes within the system, but the idea of context comes from systems, not from social constructionism. And Bateson, because I think that as I said, the social constructionism I understand, practice, write about, work, from is a mix of Bateson and also a mix of the contribution, as I said, of the a European social psychologist, and always within the frame of system. I think this is my contribution. I never embraced postmodernism.
Meaning what and why?
This idea that it was too much individualistic. It was too much based on an individual construction. I think that often social constructionism has really been explained in terms of individual construction and not in terms of interaction, as, for example, John Shutter instead did. I think that John really always, underlined the interactive part, the relational part, but the relation not in terms that I think of the relation, that I act good because I want to be in a relation. The relation as something that, unintended, something that happened, the joint action, as he would say. So I think that my contribution is this, and I've been very coherent in all these years, in my research and in my practice. I think that my contribution to the field has been this.
I love that. It reminds me of a couple of things. One is you're helping me formulate an understanding of my first publication, which was called Incitement to Riot, the politics of a postmodern therapy and the social construction of individuals and group membership. Some long title like that. But it was a critique around some of the ideological muddle that was going on between liberal humanism and the social construction of the individual, and the potential for social construction to situate people, systemic social construction, to situate people in communities. And social construction and systemic have had an interesting relationship, and a contested relationship. I remember Peter Lang saying that he was very clear that systemic and social construction were not the same. I'm sort of pointing with my hands to denote the same level of context in CMM terms. He, I think, thought that social construction, I'm thinking of Roseanne Leppington's 1991 paper in Human Systems, which was, she pointed out that social construction was the highest context at a level of ideology, that we're making our realities through language with each other over time. But that systemic ideas are the theoretical proposition that fall out of that. And then we go on to make method and so on. But sometimes I feel that it's a false distinction, and I would put systemic and social construction together, because I can't see how one can make realities or whatever without thinking about the systemic context. And I wonder, what is this part of what you're talking about, or how
Yeah,
would you put it?
absolutely. I actually think that the systemic ideas gave us a very important perspective, which is the perspective of context and interdependency. You know, so if you move some part in the system, something happens in another part and in another part. So the interconnection.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. To me, this is, I don't want to say higher or lower, but it's a frame. It's a very important frame. Then I think that social construction give us a perspective about what are the processes in this context, which is the processes of, constructing identities, realities, social realities, relationship, and so on. So we need actually, the social constructionism gave us a methodological and epistemological tool to understand processes. But if you forget the system and the context, you place all this construction within individuals.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what happened. Because, I mean, people is talking of individual constructing. Individual do not construct. The construction is a result of an interaction. And the interaction is something that happens in a context. It doesn't come out of the blue, not out of our brain. It comes from history. And history is the context, which can change through interaction.
So which is the Laura Fruggeri paper that if only one was allowed to be circulated in the world, which would you say, please, if you're going to read anything by me, read this?
There is a paper that is not though the one that I would explain all this. There's one or two papers that I wrote in Italian, actually a chapter in a book about Bateson, which I talk about the different constructionisms.
That sounds wonderful. Can't we get
and make clear this point? And I make clear this point. And I also, point out that I don't like to talk about the observer. I like to talk about the social actor.
Oh, lovely. And which year did you write that in?
It was 94.
Well, there's always two dates. There's the publication date and there's the when you wrote it date. So when you were writing it in the early 90s?
I think 94, 92, 94.
I have an idea. I have a proposal. Always nice work. Why don't we find maybe that chapter, get it translated into English?
I'd like to do that. It is. I wonder how
Well, you can have a look at it and decide, because sometimes we look back at our writings and think, no, the moment.
94. So 93, 94, I think.
In Murmurations, Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice, sometimes we usually have a paper that we revisit, and the writer gets to comment on the paper that they've written, make any additional comments, or non-observations, and maybe that could be.
Let's do that.
Let's do that. So what?
You know, I have it on file. So I have the paper in file, so I can send it to you.
Great. That's good. I'm waiting for it. We've got just a few more minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the future of the world. What needs to happen in our systemic field, or in terms of which systemic ideas that we could bring to the world? Maybe start with the first one. What does the systemic profession need?
The systemic profession needs to, I think, and this is what actually I wrote in a book that will be out in Italian in September. And I want to talk about this because I want to talk to you, not now, not today, but about this other idea I have. Now, we need to go back to the systemic tradition. We need to go back to the political tradition of the systemic approach, and take seriously the idea of co-construction. But also we need to reflect on our, and this is, on our values, on how we can still bring in difference in terms of ideas, of even of ways of constructing reality. What I mean is that it is, the systemic thinking, I think, is revolutionary, in as much as we think that healing comes from changing perspective. In this, the systemic thinking, the systemic therapy is revolutionary, because we have the idea that people can feel better if they change perspective and see things from a different point of view. So it's revolutionary. But in order to be, as therapists, revolutionary, being able to bring in differences, we need a lot to reflect on ourselves, on how we are able to change perspective in the first place. So it's the idea of check-in, irreverence. But irreverence doesn't come spontaneously, because the whole cognitive system is conservative. So we need to exercise, to make epistemological exercises in order to be able to see things in different ways and give multiple descriptions of the same thing. This is I think, the systemic tradition. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
It's the core of the systemic tradition, after all.
People are not always encouraged by institutions to feel they can be irreverent. They're meant to be following a path and produce a single story and a predictable outcome within a certain language channel. And I worry that systemic therapists may have been disempowered by our alliance with an idea of institutionalized employment, that we have become institutionalized as a profession, certainly in parts of the UK. And but how do you think, do you think that these radical ideas that you want us to come back to are just for the therapy room? Or is there
no, absolutely.
ideas have to play in the wider societal, economic, environmental worlds?
Yes, well, but not at least being a therapist. I think, yes, it can be, it can have an effect on, on the world. If we keep acting based on this idea of changing perspective, giving multiple, description of the same thing. But we do it from the position we have. I'm not the Minister of Health. I'm the people that will meet some other people.
Maybe, but why not go back to the factory gates? Is there not something that systemic ideas have to offer somewhere else? Is it just a profession that happens from 9 till 5? Or are we doing what Leah Salter and I talk about now as systemic living, where we are probably in any case embodying a lot of our ethics, our systemic values across many contexts?
Yeah. And this is what I would like to talk to you.
Okay.
I was saying, I'd like to have a conversation, you, Imelda, and I, about this, about how, exactly. My story is a story where everything has been embedded, even if for a certain period of time I was actively, in politics, at the industry's gates, giving a pamphlet about how more communist the communist should be. But I don't think that is what we need to do, or not at this stage, for example.
So let's.
But how can again systemic become, a perspective which is both political, technical, professional, and a way also of living with people, relating with people.
Let's just do something playful to end with, something a little irreverent. We don't know what they're going to say, but I'd like to propose that we invite in an imagined reflecting team in the form of who you say. Well, we'll have Imelda, you just mentioned her. We'll imagine what Imelda might say about this conversation, or this last point in particular, rather than the whole conversation. Who else should we invite in for a quick comment?
I don't know. For example, I was thinking that Luigi and Gianfranco.
Yes, let's hear from them.
Were so, Gianfranco, for example, who was so creative, so irreverent, so systemic. He had very conservative, right political ideas, both in terms of economy and in terms of politics and so on. So there must be something that is needed, a belt that has to be made explicit. It's not enough to have a systemic thinking in order to, and I don't know. I think that there is an ethic in the systemic thinking and in the systemic way of working. I I see how this, acting at this level, can have effects on other levels. But I don't know whether we should also take a political, in terms of public collective position. This, I think, it would need to reconstruct community, as Imelda always says. Because community is what has made the systemic thinking so rich and rooted, and effective in other communities.
Mm-hmm.
So probably the problem of the systemic approach is that, for example, the big conferences, I went to EFTA. That's not community. That is not, being part of a community. Thousands of people not being able to meet each other. The community we were part of were reflecting conversational communities. We could work, meet, laugh, eat, drink, reflect together. So I think this has been lost.
Well, it's
and I wonder whether this is the political part that you are saying, you are thinking.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's what we try to produce in our spring school, winter school, summer school, whatever we're calling it at the University of Bedfordshire. But it's still that political edge that worries me, that we've developed now out of all these creative, spontaneous adventures from the margins, challenging the mainstream, and we've mainstreamed them into neat trainings with curricula. And while that is absolutely useful in one set value sense, highly professional, ethical, and so on, there's something else that's missing from the story for me about, well, what does that mean for society? It's not just about working with the small and immediate unit of the individual, the couple, the family, the team. There's the bigger contexts. And of course, now we're shifting into another paradigm of factoring in other material, other creatures, and decentering ourselves as not only therapists, but as humans. In this, there are many systems we're part of that we can bring systemic thinking to if we're going to be useful beyond the consulting room. So I think this is a nice challenge that you're laying out here for systemic communities.
It is, I think.
To think about how systemic theories and practices and ways of understanding, ways of talking can be useful in other contexts, in wider contexts. We haven't stopped. Yeah. That's the point. We're still inventing.
Yeah. And we still have question marks in front of us. I mean, now I have to say more than even we thought before COVID, because, we are in a situation where almost uncertainty is the major thing, right? And what I see is that people in front of uncertainty is really taking more conservative, backward, positions. I have this idea. I'm afraid that this also, socially speaking, politically speaking, will bring more dictatorship, more wish for, the man in power and so on. Mm. So this is a period when we really need to think. But I I was talking about community as maybe the community of psychotherapists, as maybe the situation through which open up these questions that you were raising.
Well,
because, I was thinking, when I did politics, it was in a party. A party was the community where you would discuss idea. Where is the community where, we can discuss these ideas that you were raising?
And it makes me think about maybe where we're at in terms of the profession. We've become established, we're accepted as a form of psychotherapy and so on. But I'm remembering the point you made when you were describing earlier in our conversation about how you would maybe go to people at the factory gates and say, but the Communist Party now it's mainstream. It's institutionalized. You need to look at where the more radical things are happening. And I think we need to perhaps also think that the systemic profession was radical and could be radical, but is maybe in a slightly calm, institutionalized phase right now that we have the potential to break out of. And this is probably true for a lot of the psychotherapies. They've been radical, they can be oppressive, but they have the possibility to become really revolutionary with more social justice interests at heart.
I think that social justice is the issue. How we connect. I was telling you before that just before looking for new methodologies and so on, I think that my profession was very much oriented by social justice, by the idea of social justice. That was, the orientation, my theory in a way.
And it came from your family, as well as then being attracted into the different professions.
Yeah, and it came from my family. But now, your comment made me think, okay, exactly, how do we implement social justice? I think that the systemic approach is a perspective that can, help us. But how can we act in order to implement social justice as psychotherapists?
Laura Fruggeri, thank you so much for a delightful and inspiring and important and playful conversation today. I've loved that. I hope you've enjoyed it too. But
I have enjoyed it very much. And I like how you helped me to, make in the right words, ideas, which is a way of sharing it.
Yeah, it's a way of sharing it.
Yeah.
Thank you.